The morning sun was just beginning to rise over Los Angeles, casting golden hues across the vast landscape. Clint Eastwood sat on the veranda of his sprawling ranch-style home, a steaming cup of black coffee in his hands. His gaze was steady, fixed on the horizon as if he were lost in thought. Even in his older years, he still carried the unmistakable aura of the gunslingers he had played in his legendary Western films. His face, lined with decades of experience, bore the same unshakable resolve that had made him a Hollywood icon. But today, something felt different. His phone buzzed on the wooden table beside him, breaking the quiet morning. He sighed, picked it up, and saw the name of his longtime lawyer and friend, Mark Sandler. "Clint, we have a problem." Mark's voice was tense. "And it's big." Clint remained silent for a second, then calmly responded, "Go on." Mark took a deep breath. "I hate to tell you this over the phone, but the press is about to explode with a serious accusation against you. A young actress, Lisa Morrow, is claiming that you sexually harassed her back in 1995 during an audition. She says you pressured her and threatened to ruin her career." Clint's fingers tightened slightly around his coffee mug. His weathered face remained expressionless, but his mind was already racing. 1995? His voice was as steady as ever. "That's impossible. I wasn't even in Los Angeles that year. I was in Europe shooting 2 films back to back." Mark replied immediately, "I know. We have the flight records, production schedules, everything to prove you weren't even in the country. But Lisa's lawyers are powerful, and they know exactly how to manipulate the media. This is going to get ugly, fast." Clint exhaled slowly, his piercing blue eyes narrowing slightly. He had faced countless challenges in his life, from the brutality of the film industry to the hardships of war-era upbringing. But this was different. His name, his reputation, his legacy, everything was suddenly under attack. A few hours later, the news had spread like wildfire. Every major network was running the story. Clint Eastwood accused of sexual misconduct in shocking allegations. Social media was ablaze with heated debates. Some rushed to his defense, citing his decades-long reputation of professionalism and integrity, while others condemned him outright, declaring that his career was over. By noon, paparazzi had swarmed his front gate. The once quiet road leading to his house was now flooded with news vans, flashing cameras and angry protesters waving signs. "Believe women! Justice for Lisa! Hollywood's dirty secret exposed!" Clint watched from the veranda, his sharp eyes surveying the chaos. A reporter shouted questions toward the house, shoving a microphone toward the wrought iron gate. "Mr. Eastwood, do you deny the allegations? Why would Lisa Morrow lie? Are you going to issue a public statement?" He didn't flinch. He had faced down outlaws in the deserts of his films, stood unshaken in the face of ruthless villains on screen. But this was real, and in the real world, bullets weren't the only thing that could kill a man. He took another slow sip of his coffee. His silence was his weapon. But for how long? Clint Eastwood had seen many battles in his life, on screen and off. He had survived the brutality of Hollywood politics, the changing tides of the industry, and the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. But this was something else. By the evening of the first day, the media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Every major network had picked up the story. News anchors debated the allegations. Social media was flooded with hashtags like Clint Eastwood canceled, and celebrities, some of whom he had worked with, were already distancing themselves. He sat in his study, a dimly lit room lined with books and mementos from his long career. A glass of whiskey rested on the desk beside him. He had barely touched it. His longtime lawyer, Mark Sandler, sat across from him, his laptop open. "They're calling for your head, Clint," Mark said, rubbing his temples. "Sponsors are pulling out of deals. Studios don't want to be associated with you. Even the Academy is discussing stripping you of your Lifetime Achievement Awards." Clint exhaled slowly, leaning back in his leather chair. "The Academy, huh? Guess they never needed much of an excuse." His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Mark hesitated before responding. "Lisa Morrow is scheduled to do an exclusive interview tomorrow morning. She's going to tell her story, her version of it, to the world. If we don't get ahead of this, It's going to be damn near impossible to repair the damage. Clint finally took a sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly in the glass. He set it down and spoke with measured precision. She's lying. I know, Mark said, his voice firm. But in the court of public opinion, the truth doesn't always matter. A long silence settled between them. Clint's eyes flickered to a framed photograph on the desk. Himself as a younger man, standing on the set of one of his westerns, a revolver in hand, the desert wind blowing through his coat. There was a knock at the door. His daughter Allison stepped in, her expression tense. "Dad," she said, her voice heavy with concern, "I just saw the news. This is bad." "I know," Clint replied simply. She hesitated, then moved closer. "You have to say something. If you don't speak up, they'll destroy you." Clint looked at her for a long moment. Allison had grown up watching him navigate the highs and lows of Hollywood. She had always admired his strength, his ability to weather any storm. But this was different. "They already decided I'm guilty," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Doesn't matter what I say." Mark leaned forward, urgency in his tone. "You're right, but we can still fight back. We have proof you weren't even in the country when she claims this happened. If we move quickly, we can discredit her before the story cements itself as fact." Clint nodded slowly, considering his next move. He wasn't a man who panicked. He had never been one to make emotional, knee-jerk decisions. That's what had kept him standing for so long, through scandal, industry shifts, and controversy. Finally, he spoke. "Get me on the record. A statement, simple and direct. I won't beg for my name back, but I won't let them take it from me either." Mark exhaled in relief. "Good. We'll issue a written statement tonight." Before he could continue, Allison's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face tightening. "Dad, you need to see this." She turned the phone toward him. On the screen was a live broadcast. Lisa Morrow, his accuser, was already on the air. The exclusive interview had started early. On the screen, Lisa sat in a plush chair across from a famous news anchor, her eyes filled with well-practiced vulnerability. She wore a soft, pastel-colored dress, her hair styled in loose waves. "I was so young," she was saying, her voice trembling just enough to sound authentic. "I admired Clint Eastwood so much. He was my hero. And then, he took advantage of me." The anchor nodded sympathetically. "Lisa, I know this is difficult for you. Can you tell us what happened that day?" She exhaled shakily. "It was an audition. I was just starting out, desperate for a role. Clint called me into his office, alone. He said he could make me a star. Then he—" She paused, her voice breaking. "He put his hands on me." Allison turned the phone off, looking at her father. "Dad." Clint didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't frown, didn't show a trace of emotion. He simply sat there, still as a statue, absorbing every word. Mark clenched his fists. "That's it. We need to go scorched earth. I'll dig up everything I can on Lisa. If she has any skeletons in her closet, I'll find them." Clint finally spoke, his voice a low growl. "No." Mark blinked. "No? Clint, she's destroying your name." Clint's piercing blue eyes locked onto his. "I'm not going to drag her through the mud. That's not who I am." Mark exhaled in frustration, but he knew better than to argue. "Then what do we do?" Clint slowly stood up. He walked over to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. His jaw clenched slightly as he made up his mind. "We find the truth," he said, "and we let it do the talking." Outside, the distant sound of protesters and flashing cameras filled the night air. The battle had just begun. Clint Eastwood had faced many storms in his life. He had stood tall against critics, naysayers, and the ever-changing tides of Hollywood. But this was an execution without trial. By the next morning, the world had already judged him guilty. News outlets replayed Lisa Morrow's tearful interview on a loop. Social media was flooded with outrage. Former colleagues, even those who had once called him a friend, issued carefully worded statements distancing themselves from him. Some outright condemned him. If these allegations are true, it's deeply disturbing. My heart goes out to Lisa Morrow. We must listen to women. We must believe survivors. Clint Eastwood's legacy will forever be tainted. And then there were the headlines. Hollywood legend? Exposed? Clint Eastwood under fire for shocking allegations. He took advantage of me. Lisa Morrow speaks out. Oscar-winning star canceled? The end of an era? By noon, the Clint Eastwood name, a name that had once stood for integrity, grit, and resilience, was being dragged through the mud. Inside his Carmel home, Clint sat at his desk, watching everything unfold. His daughter Allison paced the room, frustration and concern etched across her face. His lawyer, Mark Sandler, was on the phone, shouting at someone. "I don't give a damn what the studio says. Clint isn't stepping down from directing his next film. You tell them we'll take legal action if they breach the contract." Allison stopped pacing. "Dad, we have to do something. This is spiraling out of control." Clint looked at her calmly. "I know." Mark hung up the phone and turned to them. "I've got good news and bad news." "Start with the bad," Clint said. Mark sighed. "Lisa is filing an official lawsuit. She's claiming emotional distress, career sabotage, and, get this, lost wages from roles she says she should have gotten if she hadn't been blacklisted after refusing your so-called advances." Allison scoffed. "That's ridiculous. She was never blacklisted. She was never even—" Clint raised a hand, stopping her. "And the good news?" Mark's eyes gleamed. "We found her Achilles heel." Clint leaned forward. "Go on." Mark opened his laptop and turned the screen toward them. "Lisa claims you harassed her in your office on May 17th, 1996. He clicked a file and a scanned document appeared on the screen. "This is your passport record from that month." Allison squinted at it. "Wait, this says Dad was in France during the Cannes Film Festival." "Exactly," Mark said. "We have documented proof you weren't even in the country when she says this happened." Clint remained silent for a moment. Then he exhaled. "That's not enough." Allison frowned. "What do you mean?" "It proves she's lying." Mark nodded. "He's right. It proves she's wrong about that date. But she could easily change her story and claim she misspoke. We need something bigger. We need to completely discredit her." Clint rubbed his jaw, deep in thought. Then a memory surfaced. "There was an assistant," he said. Mark and Allison looked at him. "What assistant?" Mark asked. "The day Lisa auditioned for that film. I wasn't even in the office alone. I remember it now. My assistant was there. The whole time." Clint's eyes sharpened. "A woman named Margaret Reynolds." Allison's face lit up. "If she was there, she can prove Lisa is lying." Mark grabbed his phone. "I'll track her down." That evening, Mark finally called Clint with an update. "I found Margaret." Clint, who had been sitting outside on his porch, watching the sun set over the Pacific, grunted. "And?" "She remembers everything." A slow smile formed on Clint's face. "I had her write a sworn statement," Mark continued. "She says you were never alone with Lisa. She was present the entire time. She's willing to testify if this goes to court." Clint exhaled. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt the tide turning. Mark's voice lowered. "But Clint, listen to me. This isn't just about facts. Public perception has already condemned you. If we want to turn this around, we need a public statement. We need to hit back." Clint swirled the whiskey in his glass, then took a long sip. "Fine," he said. "Let's hit back." Mark chuckled. "That's what I wanted to hear." The next morning, Clint Eastwood's legal team released an official statement. The accusations made by Lisa Morrow against Mr. Eastwood are false and defamatory. We have concrete evidence proving Mr. Eastwood was not even in the country on the date in question. Furthermore, a key witness has stepped forward, confirming that Mr. Eastwood was never alone with Ms. Morrow. These allegations are a baseless attempt to tarnish a legendary career. At the same time, Margaret Reynolds did an interview. She recounted exactly what had happened on the day of Lisa's audition. "I was with Clint the entire time," she stated firmly. "He never did anything inappropriate. Lisa Morrow was lying." The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded. The hashtag #Justice for Clint began trending. Fans who had initially turned their backs started questioning Lisa's credibility. Some celebrities even reversed their stances. If Clint has proof, we need to hear him out. This is why we wait for evidence before jumping to conclusions. Maybe Clint was set up. Lisa Morrow, once hailed as a survivor, was now facing scrutiny. And Clint Eastwood? He was ready for the final act. The tide had begun to turn, but Clint Eastwood knew better than to declare victory too soon. In Hollywood, perception was often more powerful than truth. And despite the evidence stacking up against Lisa Morrow, many still clung to their initial outrage. But Clint had spent a lifetime staring down adversaries. He had faced gunslingers on the silver screen and real-life battles behind the scenes. This was no different. He wasn't going to let this lie define his legacy. 2 days after Clint's legal team released their statement, Lisa Morrow finally responded. She appeared on a live morning talk show, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with forced vulnerability. "I was young," she said, her voice cracking at just the right moment. "Maybe I got the dates mixed up, but I know what happened to me." The interviewer nodded sympathetically. "So you're saying Clint Eastwood still harassed you, just not on the exact date you originally claimed?" Lisa swallowed hard. "Yes." It was a desperate attempt to salvage her crumbling story, and it backfired spectacularly. Within hours, #LisaLies was trending on social media. People weren't buying it. Screenshots of her previous statements flooded the internet, highlighting the inconsistencies. Video clips of her first interview were compared side by side with her new claims. The contradictions were undeniable. Even mainstream media, which had initially jumped on the scandal, began to backpedal. Lisa Morrow's changing story raises serious questions. Could Clint Eastwood have been falsely accused? An apology might be owed to a Hollywood legend. Then, the final nail in the coffin arrived: a leaked email. Late that night, a bombshell report hit the internet. A private email exchange between Lisa Morrow and her publicist had been leaked. It was dated 2 weeks before she made the allegations public. "Lisa Morrow, I need to make this as big as possible. If this works, I'll finally get the career I deserve." Publicist, "We have to be careful. If Clint fights back with proof, this could backfire." Lisa Morrow, "Doesn't matter. By the time he proves anything, people will already believe me." It was damning. Lisa Morrow hadn't been a victim. She had been playing a game. A cruel, calculated, career-boosting game. Within hours, her name was everywhere. But for all the wrong reasons. Her upcoming movie was pulled. Brands that had supported her quietly deleted their posts. Even her own legal team distanced themselves. Lisa Morrow had gone from Hollywood's newest survivor to its most despised liar. Clint Eastwood, meanwhile, stayed silent. He didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He let the truth speak for itself. But when the media began pressing for a response, he agreed to one interview. Sitting in front of the cameras, he looked as he always had, calm, confident, unwavering. "I've spent my life telling stories," Clint said, "and I've seen what happens when people believe a lie simply because it's easier than facing the truth." The interviewer leaned in. "What do you want to say to Lisa Morrow?" Clint met the camera's gaze. "Nothing." The world had already said enough. Lisa Morrow disappeared from the public eye. Her lawsuit was dropped. Clint Eastwood's name was cleared. But the scars remained. It wasn't about the damage to his career. He had already built his legacy. It was about the damage to truth itself. And as he sat on his porch, watching the waves crash against the shore, he took a deep breath. The storm had passed, and once again, Clint Eastwood had walked away from the fire. Unbroken.